You don't want to miss this amazing episode where Dan Roth starts from nothing and builds a full application backed by a database with full editing, validation, and everything using the magical powers of Razor Pages and ASP.NET Core MVC. Hello, and welcome to another episode of On.NET. We're running a special ASP.NET Core series, and today I have a very special guest with us. His name is Dan Roth. Dan, welcome.
Hi, thank you, Jeremy. It's great to be here.
Tell us what you do at Microsoft, and then we'll jump into it.
Sure. Yeah, I'm a program manager. I work on the .NET team, specifically on the ASP.NET team, and I work on all of our web UI frameworks. So MVC, Razor Pages, and most recently, I've been spending an awful lot of time working on Blazor.
Well, we will definitely get to Blazor. That's an exciting new technology. But first, we want to talk a little bit about Razor and MVC. So my understanding is these are some options that you have within ASP.NET Core applications. But what is really the 30-second elevator pitch, if you will? If someone says, I have no clue what these things are, what do you tell them?
Yeah, so MVC has been the workhorse of web development on .NET for a good long while now. MVC is actually just a UI design pattern. Model View Controller is what MVC stands for. And this is a UI design pattern that's been around since like the 1970s with like Smalltalk. But basically the idea is to decouple the concerns from the view, the part that the user sees, from the rest of the app, its app logic and its data, and from how user input gets handled. So the controller handles the user input. The controller then uses that to manipulate the model, the actual data and logic that makes up the app, which is then used to update the view, which is what gets shown to the user. And these three parts should remain reasonably independent so they can be updated independently. So MVC is a framework. ASP.NET MVC is a web UI framework that has existed for a long time on the .NET framework for building applications that follow this design pattern. And then more recently, we have ASP.NET Core MVC, which is our high-performance, cross-platform implementation of MVC that you can use to build your web applications. It looks very much like the earlier version of MVC, ASP.NET MVC, but replatted on top of the ASP.NET Core and also .NET Core.
So if I'm doing file new for a web project today, that's the latest flavor that I want to go with, is the ASP.NET Core MVC.
That's right. If you want to follow the model view controller paradigm, ASP.NET Core MVC is what you're going to want to use. It's really great for productivity. It's great for keeping things decoupled so you can do things like testing. If you want to unit test your controllers, the MVC pattern and the MVC implementation makes that really easy to do.
And then we talked about Razor. Where does Razor fit into this whole picture?
So Razor is used for the V part, the view part of your application. Razor is a language for creating dynamic UI, generating dynamic UI. The language is a mixture of HTML and C#. So you author the logic that you want to use for rendering that particular view using C# intermixed with the actual HTML markup that you want to render. It's very much like existing templating engines, but it's quite a bit more powerful because you have the full flexibility of C# at your fingertips while you're trying to define your Razor logic. Razor as a language typically is used in a .cs HTML file if you're doing MVC or Razor Pages based applications, or if you want to build UI components that get used on the client, they can also be used in a .razor file if you happen to be developing with Blazor.
Okay. And then I just have to ask this because I know developers are inundated with web frameworks, and someone's bound to say, well, maybe I'm interested in Angular or Vue or React or one of these SPA frameworks. How would that relate to ASP.NET Core MVC and Razor?
Yeah, so if you're talking about a framework like Angular or React, those are frameworks that run client-side on the user's machine in the browser using the JavaScript runtime that comes with the browser. So that's a client-side model for dealing with UI. Not that dissimilar from like a desktop app. Like the process that's actually manipulating the pixels on the screen lives on the user's machine. Those applications, Angular, React, are being also written in JavaScript. With a framework like ASP.NET Core and MVC and Razor Pages, these are server-rendered UI applications. So what I mean by that is the browser, instead of doing all the UI manipulation locally, it's sending requests to the server where your .NET code then runs. It then executes like a controller and updates the model and then uses some Razor to generate a view, which at the end of the day is going to dynamically produce like a bunch of HTML, which gets sent down in the response back to the browser so that it can be rendered to the screen. So it's a much thinner model for in terms of the what you're requiring the user's device to be able to handle, because you're doing most of the hard work for generating the UI, manipulating the UI on the server. And you get all the flexibility of having being able to use .NET and being able to leverage the power and the environment of the server.
Okay, that's great. So I was going to ask you sort of what decisions would drive a developer to decide to go with a client-side framework versus ASP.NET Core MVC, but it sounds like you've addressed that. Now, it also sounds to me like, you know, in your description of Razor Pages, it's something that's probably easier shown than said, maybe. Do you have anything you can show us so we can see what this feels like as a developer?
Yeah, I mean, before we show Razor Pages, like there's actually, and this can be a little confusing, I know, there's Razor the language, but then there's also Razor Pages, which is another pattern that we support in ASP.NET Core. So it's probably worth talking a little bit about like, well, what is Razor Pages then, once you know what Razor is. Razor Pages is a page-based UI model for building web UI. It's again server rendered. You're going to render the HTML from the server in response to requests. But instead of setting up a full controller and a model and a view, you just create pages in the application for handling those requests. If you're familiar with older .NET web frameworks like ASP.NET Web Pages, or even to some extent ASP.NET Web Forms, this may sound a little familiar to you. And those frameworks are typically very page-centric in terms of how you build out the UI. So Razor Pages gives you that page-centric pattern, but it's actually built on all the same infrastructure as the MVC support in ASP.NET Core. It's actually not a separate framework. It's built on entirely the same pipeline. So when a request comes in, all the same MVC infrastructure is actually being used to eventually dispatch or route that request to a page, which then renders that page is written in Razor, just like an MVC view would be written in Razor, and that returns the response. We get asked, because we have these two different patterns, an MVC pattern and a Razor Pages pattern, a lot of times we get asked, well, when should I use which one and when? If you are familiar with the MVC pattern and you like it and you're used to it, then you should keep using it. I mean, MVC pattern is great. It's very flexible. Razor Pages, we think, is a little bit more approachable for a new dev. Like if you've never done ASP.NET or ASP.NET Core before and you're trying to build your first web app, Razor Pages has a few less moving parts, so it can be a little bit simpler just to get started with. But both are built on top of the same technology, so they're pretty much equally flexible. There's no like technical limitations of one versus the other. It really just becomes a preference, a personal preference at that point.
Nice. So would I be correct in assuming if I'm used to a desktop-based model, like working with, say, WinForms or WPF, is there one type of design approach in the web that's going to be easier for me to transition to or not?
You know, that's a great question. The web is a bit of a different beast, particularly when you start talking about server-rendered stacks. Some of the client UI patterns, like when we start talking about something like Blazor, which has a component model and a component-based mode of composition, there are more things there that then start to feel familiar if you're coming from a desktop background, because a desktop developer is really in the mindset that my process is right here, right? Like I just do everything I need to do on this machine, and I can maintain state right here in the user's process. That's super easy because they've got memory. I can use that. Whereas when you're thinking about a web app that's server rendered, you have to think about, well, often that app's going to be stateless. You're going to make a request. It's going to generate the response, and then any state you were dealing with either got persisted to a database or it's completely gone away. Those types of differences will exist whether you're picking MVC or Razor Pages, because they're both fundamentally running on the server. But when you start talking about something like Blazor, though, I think you find things start to feel a bit more familiar, because it's just more of a stateful programming model. You're dealing with components just like you would deal with controls, that type of thing.
That's good. And we'll be doing an episode on Blazor, so we'll get more into the details then.
Let me show you a little Razor Pages. Let's take a look.
All right.
Let's go ahead and get started with Razor Pages. So I've just browsed here to the .NET website. If you don't know how to get to this website, you can just go to .net, and that'll bring you right here. There's the Get Started link for, if you want to build your first console app, if you've never done .NET or C# development before. But if you just scroll down a little bit and get started with the web, that will bring you to the ASP.NET page. And now click Get Started, and that will bring you to a nice tutorial that walks you through how to build your first Razor Pages based application. I'm going to go ahead and do that. So I've got Visual Studio installed on my machine. Let's create a new project. And I'm going to create an ASP.NET Core web application using C#. Click Next. And let's call this Razor Pages Movies. And click Create. We'll create a little app that lets us maintain like a catalog of movies. Okay, and then in the create a new ASP.NET Core web application dialog, there's all sorts of options here. You can create a very simple empty app, an API. We're just going to create a web app. Web app is going to be Razor Pages based. If you prefer the MVC model, like with controllers and views, then you'll want to select the model view controller template. But I'm going to do Razor Pages, and we'll go ahead and create that. And what Visual Studio is going to do is set me up with a basic ASP.NET Core project that's based on Razor Pages. It will wire up some niceties like Bootstrap for handling styles, and a couple of basic pages just so that it's easy to get started with. Now, remember I said Razor Pages is a page-based model. So you can see here in there's this Pages folder that has a bunch of CS/HTML files. Those are all Razor Pages. Like here's the home page for my app, and you can see it's got normal HTML in it, but we have the ability to stick C# code blocks into the Razor for dynamically generating some HTML. All right, I'm going to go ahead and just run this so we can see what this app does. And let it build and start the server so that we can host the application. And there we go. Okay, so pretty Spartan app, not too complicated. We have a home page. There's a little privacy page if you want to stick your app's privacy policy there. Some nice styling, all based off of Bootstrap, and these are all pages. So if we go back to the application, there's the privacy page, the CS/HTML file. We can add a little bit of code now to this app. Let's what should we do here? So let's add another p tag inside of our little div here, and let's say the current time is, and then I'm going to switch to C# here. And the way you switch to C# in Razor is using the @ sign. So now that I've typed the @ sign, the tooling and the compiler now knows that this part is supposed to be C#. So let's say I want to put the current time here. So date time. You notice I'm getting nice IntelliSense, date time now. And save that, and then let's go back to the application, and we should just be able to refresh. Visual Studio should detect that change and rebuild the app, tear it down and start it up again, and you can see that now we have the current time is and the string form of that datetime.now. So we're mixing C# logic with HTML in order to dynamically generate some UI. So that's your most basic getting started experience. If you want to try that, that's what this little tutorial will walk you through, creating your first app and getting it running and then editing some code so you can display the current time. Once you've done those basics, you can probably then jump to a more involved tutorial. This is the Razor Pages Getting Started tutorial. And what we're going to do is, well, creating a bunch of pages by hand, that's cool. It's fairly lightweight model, fairly easy thing to do. But what if we want to connect those pages now to some data? Like I want to read some data out of a database and be able to edit things with forms and save stuff back to the database. How do we do all that? Well, we could hand code it all. But fortunately, you don't have to hand code everything because Razor Pages, just like MVC, supports scaffolding based off of a data model. So if we want to generate some of our UI based off of a data model, we can pretty easily do that. So what I'm going to do is let's just add a simple data type to our project. I'm going to create this little movie type that you can get out of the docs. I'm just going to copy that. Let's go back to our app. And I'm going to add a models folder. Let's call this, and let's call it models. And let's add a class to this models folder. And I guess we'll call it movie, since this is going to be a movie. We'll just paste that in there. OK, and we'll take a quick look at this model. Notice that, so this is a class, just a normal C# class. It has an ID, so it can be uniquely identified in the database. It's got a title, it's got a release date, the genre of the movie, and a price. There's this interesting data type attribute that's on the release date. What is that all about? Well, this is a data annotation, which is just an attribute-based programming model for decorating your data models with additional information that can be used for validation and for UI rendering. And here we're saying that even though this release date is a full date time, we actually only really care about the date. Please, don't provide a UI for this thing that lets the user specify the time. There's no point. The only thing we care about really is the date. Okay, so now we just have a class. We'll just save that. And now we want to scaffold some pages based off of this class. So I'm going to go into my pages folder. That's where all my Razor pages live. And I'm going to add a new folder. Let's call it movies. Great. And let's add now a Razor page. So clicking this will then bring up the scaffolding UI in Visual Studio. There's also a command line version of this if you want to run scaffolding from the command line. I'm going to select Razor Pages using EF, and we'll select Add. OK, and then we can just pick our model type that we created previously. There's the movie type. And then we need to select a data context class. This is the type that's going to represent the connection to the database. This is all handled through Entity Framework Core, which Jeremy, you know plenty about this, since that's the technology that you work on. We don't currently have a DB context in our application, so we're just going to click the plus button to create one. And that looks like a lovely name for a DB context. And everything else we can just leave as the default. The generated pages are going to pick up the app's layout, and they're going to include some helper script libraries, so we get things like validation. So all those goodies we'll just leave selected. So go ahead and click Add. And then Visual Studio is going to write a whole bunch of code for us so that we don't have to. That's the beauty of scaffolding, is you can quickly create a whole bunch of UI that's very functional without having to do a whole lot of work. So Visual Studio is installing the appropriate generators for this project so that it can create Razor pages, or likewise, you can do the same thing with MVC views and controllers, and then set up the project with all the pieces that it needs to use those new pages. It should just take just a second.
And by using Entity Framework, when you are dealing with the database, you're not going to have to deal with SQL script and all of that DBA activity.
It makes you shudder, doesn't it? Yes. Okay, so in our movies folder now, we have a whole bunch of Razor pages that just got created for us. We've got this index page. This means that when we browse to /movies, the path to these Razor pages, that's what's going to determine the route for these pages. An index is kind of like the page that gets rendered at the root of this particular path. We can see there's like a whole bunch of HTML markup in here, as well as some C# code, like these at HTML display name for. This is basically taking our model and getting information out of it to display data from our database. So getting the title, the movies, the release dates, displaying all those headers, and then displaying the, this is actually displaying the header names and then displaying the actual data values down below. Now, to get this app to run, we actually have to do one more thing. If I just ran this, it would, the server would have an error and say, like, wait, there's no database. Like, how am I supposed to get all these movies if there's no database? So we need to create a database. And the way we can do that is by using migrations. So I'm going to just pop up the moral equivalent of a console. I'm going to go into the NuGet Package Manager console right here. It'd be nice if we just had a more first-class citizen for this, but this is what we get in Visual Studio. And we're going to say add migration, and you do get completion, so you can just hit tab, and we'll say initial create. This is just giving the migration a name. Now, what is this doing? This is going to look at the DB context in our project, and we'll set up some code that can initialize the database based off of the structure of that DB context. So we'll go ahead and add that migration code. And then when we run update database, after this succeeds, there it goes. Yeah, update database. That will now run that migration, create the database for us so it's all ready to receive our movies data. So update database. And builds the project for us, and that looks like that's going to succeed. As going there, perfect. Okay, so that should now be running. So let's go ahead and rerun the application. All right, so we still have our basic home page, but now we should be able to browse to movies. And here's our scaffolded UI. Now, we don't have any movies yet because we didn't populate the database with any data. We just set up its schema, but we already have UI for creating new movies. Let's see, what movie should we do? Like, all the best movies were made in the 80s. Like this is true. Like, you should go check, like, IMDb. Like, all the best movies were done in the 80s. So, I think I actually looked this up because this is one of my favorite movies as a child. It was Short Circuit. I think it's 1986 is when this was made. It's like the robot that gets hit by lightning.
Number 5 alive.
Number 5 alive. Yes, Stephanie. I don't know. This has got to be an expensive movie now.
No disassemble.
And there we go. And then you can go click on the details. We get like a master details view. We can edit it and so forth. Now, one of the nice things about Razor Pages is it handles forms and validation for us. Like if I want to update this and say, no, actually Short Circuit was a horror movie. This was a terrible, we can save that. And what's going to happen there? Well, that works. You can see now it's a horror movie. How was that all handled? If we go look at the edit page, which is what had that form on it, this is all the UI logic for that form. So it's just a normal HTML form. And we have divs and inputs and stuff for actually editing the movie. But we got all this other cool stuff in this dark purple. These are called tag helpers. These are little decorators on the HTML that allow some .NET code to run and modify those HTML tags. They can even be, custom tags if you want. These are tags that run on the server, not custom tags that run on the client, but it's a way to author your HTML in a very natural way. So you'll notice that we have a div here at the top with like a validation summary tag helper that's saying, if there's any problems with the form that you're about to submit, display the validation errors here. And then we have each of the different fields that we're sending, like the movie title. We've got the label. The name of the label is going to be generated for us based off of our model. The input, text, typing, and UI will be generated based off of her model. And then we have a validation span for each of the fields. So if we go back, and let's edit this again. Let's say I do something inappropriate, like type ABC for the price. Like that's not a real price. And I tab off of that. You can see I'm getting validation errors right here. Like even client side in the browser. Everything's been wired up so that a little bit of JavaScript can run and check that, that's not a valid value for a price. You can't do that. So if we change it back to, what is it, $29.99. and we're back to being good. So that will be valid. And the validation will kick in not just on the client, but also server side. Like when the form is actually submitted, that will then go to the page model for this page, which we should have a on-post page handler down here. This is the code that will actually run when that form is submitted to the server. And you can see that the model state will be checked to see if it's valid. And if it's not valid, we just re-render the page with all the validation errors. This is one of the nice features of both MVC and Razor Pages, which is the ability to bind data from the form. In this case, all the data is being bound to this property, this movie property. And if there's any problems with it, the system can validate that bound data, that model bound data, and provide nice error messages back to the user. So that is a little bit of Razor Pages. And you can see we got an app up and running super fast, able to connect to a database, pull some data out, has some UI that does model binding and validation really, really simply.
So that was a great demo. Not only were you able to very quickly stand up a full website, and thank goodness for things like Bootstrap, so people like me who have no design sense whatsoever can look it out of the gate, but all of that code is generated in a logical way so that if I need to tweak it or customize it, I can easily go back in and make all the changes I need to.
Yeah. Oh, the mysteries of CSS. Like if only some of us knew how that worked. yeah, Bootstrap's great, and the code, once it's scaffolded, like it's yours. Like you can tweak and modify that code to your heart's content. It's now part of the project.
Well, I feel like if I was asked by my boss to write a quick admin page over some tables or even spin something up new, that this is one way I could get it done quickly and be a hero. So I'm pretty excited about the prospects. Thank you so much for coming and sharing Razor Pages and MVC with us. And as you mentioned, dotnet, right? dotnet is the place to land. And then click through on the web, get started, and you're good to go. Hi, I'm Jeremy Lickness. You've watched another episode of On.net. Thank you for joining us. Be sure to like and subscribe so that you don't miss a show. And if you're interested in more shows, check out the link right here. Thanks.